Hello everyone, this lecture is about Unit 1, Standard 6, which is about conservation biology and global change. So every chapter we've been learning up to this point has been about species and populations and communities, ecosystems. This whole chapter, I talked about ecosystems being one of my favorite. This is truly my favorite as we talk about how do we conserve those ecosystems that we've been talking about, those communities. How do we conserve and maintain what we already have? So conservation biology, the definition of it, it's a goal-oriented science that seeks to counter the biodiversity crisis. Okay, maybe wondering, what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is just what it sounds. Bio, the prefix meaning life, and diversity, which you know is, as we talked about in previous chapters and what you know in real life, you know that diversity is trying to maintain the whole different species altogether. We're trying to counter the biodiversity crisis, which is the current rapid decrease in Earth's variety of life. Okay, how do we know that something's going wrong? Something called extinction, which you may have heard of before. It's a natural phenomenon that is occurring since life evolved on Earth. So ever since, even before there was cars and planes, animals went extinct before us. The current rate of extinction, though, is what underlies the biodiversity crisis. The rate at which animals and plants and living things are being extinct is much faster than any time in the period in the life of Earth. And a high rate of species extinction, surprise, surprise, is caused by us, humans. So here are the three levels of biodiversity, or here are the three things that we're trying to maintain. We're talking about genetic diversity. So these are supposed to be examples of chromosomes in different animals. We want to make sure that within an ecosystem that we are genetically diverse. We talked about in the previous chapter, we don't want to be all the same genetically because one disaster, one disease, or one anything can wipe us all out if we're not diverse. So we want genetic diversity. There's also species diversity, which, as you know, is the different types of animals within an ecosystem. And then there's ecosystem diversity. So within or on planet Earth, we want different ecosystems to be able to coexist, just like they show in this picture here. So what are the threats to biodiversity? What's causing this biodiversity to cease? We've got four of them. Okay, one of them is habitat loss. So us destroying habitats is the greatest threat to biodiversity. As you said in class, as I asked you all in class, you know one of the biggest habitat losses that's always advertised is the rainforest. We talked about in a previous chapter also introduced species. They're also called invasive or non-native species. When we put in a species that doesn't belong in that ecosystem, that also threatens biodiversity. Overexploitation, so harvesting wild plants, animals, killing so many animals for our food, or harvesting too many plants, that's called overexploitation. And then global change, when we alter the climate and the atmosphere and ecosystems, that also reduces the capacity to sustain life. So you should know these four threats to diversity. So one of the things that some things that people can do to ruin the ecosystem is something called movement corridors. So I just want to make sure that you understand this vocabulary term. A movement corridor is the concept or idea of making taking a big ecosystem and fragmenting it with like in this example, in this picture, we put like a freeway right through an ecosystem, or a road or a fence. So if you just didn't know what it means a movement corridor is some path that breaks up or fragments a habitat, and that promotes dispersal or migration, things like that weren't naturally supposed to be there. So where are the biodiversity hotspots? Where do we see a whole bunch of this diversity, which is awesome? You'll notice that they tend to be close to the equator. There's warmer waters and warmer weather. So we have Central America, north of South America, parts of Africa, and a lot in Southeast Asia, as well as all the islands. You'll also see they're close to bodies of water. So here in the Mediterranean, you see a whole bunch of biodiversity. Down here in the south, and as well we see here down south as well. So you notice that it's frequently where there's lots of water and close to the equator. Some people forget there's also marine biodiversity as well. So not just land, but you see these blue triangles. These are places in the world. There are places in the world where there's also biodiversity. They tend to be where there's coral reefs and also very close to the equator. You don't need to memorize all these. And again, as I keep telling you, reminding you for the AP Bio test, you need to just know places in your back pocket or where is there biodiversity you should know. Another thing that's bad for the environment that humans cause is something called eutrophication. So we don't really experience this since none of us live on a farm, or maybe some of you have lived on a farm. But what's one of the worst things that farmers do, or those on ranches and farms that are bad for environment, are when they they put too many pesticides and put too much of they spray too much stuff onto the plants and stuff like that. The problem with that is that when they put all that stuff onto the plants or their crops, when there's a rain, the rain washes all that extra sprayed chemicals into oceans and rivers. So it goes into a river and eventually it flows into the ocean. So excess nitrogen from agriculture enters aquatic ecosystems. So what happens is that here's the difference between winter and summer. But when they all flow into the water, you get a bloom of algae and bacteria. Okay, by having too much, because there's so much nitrogen in the water, we have so much algae and bacteria in the water. Because we have so much of that, they take all the oxygen away from all the fish and other invertebrates in the water. So that's called eutrophication. They also call it red tides because the water, I know this is kind of like an infrared picture, but the water also can look red. So that's called eutrophication. We also talked about it in one of the chapters previously called eutrophic lakes. Second thing is called acid precipitation. You may know it better as acid rain. Acid, as you know, is from chemistry, is a pH less than 5.6. So you may be saying, I've never seen acid rain, or in your head you may be wondering what acid rain is. It actually is very common, and if you wanted to, you could take water when the next time it rains and measure its pH, and you'll notice it's actually slightly acidic. How does our rain get acid, or how do we get acid rain? Well, if we burn, especially for us here in the United States, if we burn fossil fuels, I'm talking about gas, and remember, to get electricity you have to burn gas. The burning of gas puts sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides into the air. The problem with the sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides is, as you know from the water cycle, when water vapor rises and mixes and makes clouds, the sulfur and the nitrogen also get mixed up in that cycle. So it reacts with the water, and then every time it rains down, you get acid. You'll notice that it's nice and green over here on the west coast, and so yellow and red on the east coast. Why? The reason why is because most of the coal and the sulfur power plants are all on the east coast, but not so much on the west coast. So that's why their rain or precipitation tends to be more acidic than us here on the west coast. And we don't just say acid rain, because the acid can also exist in the form of snow or fog. To see what it looks like, here's a forest that's been affected by acid rain or acid precipitation. Here's a statue that's gone bad because of acid rain. So you should know that acid rain is another thing that we do to ruin biodiversity, and it actually happens every single time we have rain. Most people don't know that. Next thing you need to know is something called biomagnification. Biomagnification means something exists at the bottom of the food chain and it gets magnified up to the top of the food chain. So say for example there's toxins, and these toxins are eaten by plankton. Okay, a whole bunch of plankton is eaten by, this one says smelt, a whole bunch of smelts is eaten by trout, and a whole bunch of trout is eaten by birds. So what happens is that once they eat these toxins at the bottom of the food chain, they can't be digested. Same thing with the fish that eat them, and the fish that eat those fish, and the birds that eat those fish. So it gets magnified as they get higher and higher. So toxins can't be broken down, and they magnify in concentration up the food chain. So if a plankton eats a toxin, say for example there's like a poison in the water, it gets 0.1, they call this parts per million. Okay, so it's a very small concentration. This smelt eats tons of plankton, and now its concentration of the toxin becomes 1. Still not so bad, 1 part per million. Okay, the trout will eat a whole bunch of smelts, and it becomes 4.8 parts per million, which again is also not bad. But then these birds that eat them, and then when they lay eggs, it ends up that they have 124 parts per million in toxins, which is very lethal. Again, it's magnified as you go up and up because they eat more, and again, it's very dangerous for ecosystems up here. The biggest case study you'll hear about biomagnification is called mercury. You may have heard of mercury and how bad it is. There was actually a situation in Japan where a factory sort of dumped its mercury into the water. The plankton ate it, the fish ate it, and you should know, you may or may not know, but the Japanese have a very strong or heavy diet in fish, and it killed off and made very, very, very many humans sick in addition to animals. Another thing, again, we're just going down this laundry list of things that we do to mess up the planet. Next thing is ozone. You may have heard of the ozone layer. Ozone is is O3. You should know O2 is oxygen, O3 is ozone. Ozone is actually good for us in the atmosphere because it protects us from UV rays, but it's really bad in our atmosphere. If we breathe ozone, it's really bad. There are places like the aquarium or other public places where they have an ozone alarm if it's too high. So what happens is that we have chlorine-containing compounds, and if we have, you may have heard of aerosols and things like that. We used to use it for refrigeration and air conditioning. That stuff, when put in the air, breaks down ozone, which makes a big hole for UV rays to come down to the Earth. So just as a good contrast, here's 1979. Here's 1979, and here's 2009. This ozone hole is in blue, or the ozone layer is in green, and the hole is when you could see blue. So you could see in just 30 years, this hole got so much larger, and the layer is just eroding away. Here's the thickness by year. So in 1955, here's the thickness of ozone, and back down here, we're way low. You may notice that in the 2000s, we actually spiked back up, but now it's going back down again. So us humans are ruining ozone. Another type of thing, people get these two confused. There's a difference between the ozone layer and the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect, you may have learned this before, is the sun comes down to the Earth, and then when it comes back up or tries to bounce back up off the Earth, there's this layer of atmosphere that blocks the heat from leaving the Earth. This is what actually causes us to live on Earth. Like, that's why the Earth is nice and warm and is perfect for us, because it bounces down and it can't leave. The problem is that this layer gets too thick and we're not letting any heat leave, so it's getting too hot. You may have noticed in the last couple of weeks it's been too hot, so some of that could be contributed to global warming. You may be wondering, how does this layer of atmosphere trap more heat than usual? That layer is made up of two things, carbon dioxide and water vapor. Carbon dioxide comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So when you burn fossil fuels, when you burn gas, when you use electricity, that puts carbon dioxide in the air, makes this layer really thick, which means heat can escape. When you talk about being disastrous, it means you may have heard about melting of the polar caps, changes in heat, and also more or stronger, more violent natural disasters. Okay. As you can see in this chart, it was made famous by Al Gore in Inconvenient Truth, but the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has grown exponentially just in the last 50 years, and it's going even higher and higher and higher, and quite frankly, it's all because of the burning of fossil fuels. So the last thing about global warming is that they predict that the Earth will rise 3 degrees Celsius. Remember, this is Celsius, so it's actually a very extreme spike in temperature, all because of the doubling of the carbon dioxide. These rising temperatures can cause polar ice cap melting, which you talked about. So here's this poor polar bear with their ice cap melting. And you may notice also that when polar ice caps melt, coastal areas will flood, we're more likely to flood. How do you fix it? You should know that we should use less fossil fuels, so carpooling, not driving as much, turning off electricity, and also reducing deforestation. Remember, plants, they breathe in carbon dioxide, so the more that we cut down plants, the more carbon dioxide goes up into the air. So I hope you enjoyed, or not enjoyed, but learned a lot about conservation biology. If you have any questions, again, you could see me in class, and you could follow along in the reading to help you understand what these things mean if you need additional help. So thank you for watching, and I'll see y'all later.